The magistrate did not look up from his ledger when he told Leonora that he had arranged her future. The study at Ashmore Grange smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, and the lamp on the desk had been burning since before dawn, because her father, Clement Pryce, kept hours that suited no one but himself. Leonora stood 3 feet behind his chair, close enough to read the open ledger upside down, which she did, because reading things upside down was a habit she had never been able to break and had long since stopped apologising for. The figure at the bottom of the column was £14,000. Her father scratched a signature at the bottom of a second document, blotted it, and pushed both papers toward the solicitor sitting across from him without a word. "You will be a countess," her father said to the ledger. "Most women in your position would consider themselves fortunate." Leonora said nothing. She had been managing her father's correspondence since she was 15, sorting his case files, drafting his letters to the circuit court, reading depositions aloud, while he sat with his eyes closed and pretended to listen. She had kept every number in her head because her father could not keep them in his. She knew exactly what £14,000 looked like against what remained of the Pryce family's assets, which was to say very little, and she knew what this signature had just purchased: her hand, her consent, her life bound up in a contract she had not been shown. The solicitor gathered the papers and left. Her father poured himself a glass of port and opened the Racing Gazette. Leonora walked upstairs, sat down on the edge of her narrow bed, and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not grief exactly, something older and quieter. The understanding that the man downstairs had been failing steadily for years, and that she had been the one holding the household together while he failed, and that the moment she stopped being useful in that capacity, he had found another use for her entirely. She pressed her hands together and breathed, then she got up and began to think. Leonora Pryce was 23 years old, and she had spent the better part of the last decade reading medical texts, not because anyone had asked her to. Her mother had died of a fever when Leonora was 12, attended by a physician who had not known what kind of fever it was and had therefore treated it incorrectly, and afterward Leonora had gone to her mother's bookshelf and begun reading everything on it. She had moved on to her father's medical references, then to the lending library in the village, then to correspondence with the apothecary in town, who was a precise and generous man named Mr. Fitch, who had lent her his own annotated volumes, and occasionally answered her letters. By the time she was 20, she could identify most common poisons by symptom pattern. She could read a pharmaceutical ledger the way her father read a racing form. She knew the difference between a dose that healed and a dose that didn't, and she knew that the line between the two was narrower than most people understood. None of this had ever made her father look up from his ledger. She thought of the name she had read on the contract before the solicitor closed his case: Gideon Ashby, Earl of Castellan. The county called him the Deaf Earl, though no one said it to his face. He had not appeared at any public function in 18 months. His estate sat on the far edge of the northern county, behind a wall of spruce trees and a reputation for inhospitality. He was said to be cold, solitary, and profoundly difficult to speak with, for the obvious reason. She had never met him. She had read about him once, in the margins of a disputed inheritance case that had crossed her father's desk 3 years ago. The notation in her father's hand had read, "Castellan, matter closed, per arrangement." She had not known what arrangement. She knew now that she had filed it away in exactly the wrong drawer of her memory. The morning she left Ashmore Grange, her father was not yet awake. A creditor had come to the door at 7:30, and Leonora had opened it herself, given the man a precise date for the next instalment, and shown him out. Then she had carried her own trunk to the front step, climbed into the carriage that was waiting, and pulled the door closed behind her. The house did not look any different as the carriage moved away. She had expected to feel something more than she did. She felt mostly cold. The road to Castellan House took 5 hours north, through farmland that gave way to forest, and then to a landscape of grey rock and shallow lakes that reflected the November sky. By the time the iron gates appeared between the spruce trees, the light had flattened to the colour of pewter, and her hands were stiff inside her gloves. Castellan House was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something grim and shuttered. Instead, the house was large and well-maintained. 3 stories of pale stone with tall windows, and a gravel drive so raked it looked architectural. The grounds were immaculate. The gardens had been put to bed for winter with the kind of care that suggested someone paid close attention to the grounds, even when no one was watching. A man in a dark coat was waiting at the door. "Mr. Galt," he said and bowed, "steward of Castellan House. His lordship is expecting you." Behind him, a young woman in a white apron stepped forward. "I'm Bridget, miss. I'm to attend you." Bridget's eyes were watchful and kind. Leonora followed her inside. The entrance hall smelled of beeswax and cold stone. There was no music, no conversation. The staff moved through their work in near silence, not the silence of grief, but of habit, of a household that had organized itself around quietness the way other houses organized themselves around convenience. He was in the drawing room. Leonora noticed the room first. The way the 2 footmen near the door stood a degree straighter as she crossed the threshold, the way Bridget slowed almost imperceptibly beside her. Then she noticed him. Gideon Ashby, Earl of Castellan, was standing by the window with his back half-turned to the door, looking out at the grey November grounds. He was tall, lean and very still, dressed in dark wool with his hands clasped behind his back. His hair was the colour of dark amber, and he wore no powder. When he turned at what must have been a vibration in the floor, his face was angular and composed, and his eyes were a clear, steady grey. He did not look deaf. She was not sure what she had expected, but it was not this, not a man who turned with such precision, who oriented himself to her with the easy assurance of someone who had simply been waiting. He held a small chalkboard in his left hand. "Miss Pryce, the vicar is waiting in the chapel. I see no reason for ceremony before the ceremony." His handwriting was quick and clear. He set the board down before she could respond, and walked toward the door with the deliberate, even pace of a man who had mapped every room he intended to move through and saw no need to hesitate. The wedding was as brief as his note had suggested. The chapel was stone-walled and cold, attended only by Mr. Galt, Bridget, the vicar, and a woman Leonora had not been introduced to, who sat in the front pew with a straight back and an expression of concentrated assessment. She was perhaps 60, small-boned, dressed in charcoal silk, with eyes the same grey as Gideon's. "His aunt," Gideon wrote, when Leonora glanced toward her, "Lady Constance Ashby. She lives in the East Wing and considers herself the final authority on all household matters." Lady Constance did not look at the chalkboard. She looked at Leonora. The look was thorough and unreadable, and lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Leonora held her gaze and did not look away. The vicar spoke the words. Gideon faced slightly to her left through most of it, and Leonora wondered, for the first time, whether the deafness was complete or partial, whether he lip-read, whether the angle he held himself at throughout the service was habitual or deliberate. When the ring was placed, his hand found hers without fumbling. His fingers were warm and his grip was exact, and the ring slid on as though he had known its dimensions precisely. Then his hand was at his side, and his eyes had moved to the middle distance. And Leonora folded the observation into the back of her mind, where she put things that didn't fit neatly into the categories she had available. After the chapel, he walked her to the base of the main staircase. "You will have the south rooms. I keep the north wing. Dinner at 7. Mr. Galt will explain the rest." He turned away. At the end of the corridor, he stopped, his free hand flat against the wall, and stood there for one motionless moment before something released in him, and he walked on. Leonora went upstairs. Her rooms were warm, well-aired, and carefully arranged. A fire in the grate, fresh flowers in a green ceramic jug, a writing desk beneath the window, stocked with ink and paper, and 3 good pens. A shelf of books arranged by subject, not by height, natural history, pharmacology, 2 volumes of case law, and a French dictionary. Someone had known what she read. "Is there anything you need, my lady?" Bridget asked. "What happened to the Earl's hearing?" Leonora asked. Bridget's eyes went to the door, then back. "We don't discuss it, my lady." Her voice was kind but firm. The door closed. Leonora sat down at the writing desk and looked at the books on the shelf, the pharmacology texts in particular, and thought about who had put them there. Dinner was conducted via Gideon's chalkboard and the longest table she had ever sat at. He wrote when he wanted to communicate something. Otherwise, they ate in silence, which was not uncomfortable exactly, but which had a shape to it, like a conversation between 2 people who had not yet agreed on what language to use. She watched him across the candlelight. He ate without hesitation, reached for the correct glass every time, oriented himself to the footman's movements, with the quiet attentiveness of a man who read his environment through means other than sound. When he looked at her, he looked directly at her face. His eyes did not wander. After dinner, she was not tired enough for sleep, and the thought of sitting alone in the south rooms on her wedding night, with nothing but the fire and her own thoughts, was worse than the thought of the library she had noticed off the main corridor. She went looking for a book. She found him instead. The library was dark except for the fire. Gideon stood before it with his back to the door, holding a small framed portrait in both hands. He had set the chalkboard down somewhere. His shoulders were drawn together, and his head was bowed, and in the firelight his face, caught in the reflection of the glass-fronted bookcase to his left, was undefended in a way that nothing about him had been since she arrived. He was grieving. She recognized it the way she recognized a clinical presentation, not by inference, but by the specific particulars of it. The set of his jaw, the way his breath moved, the portrait held in both hands like something that might break if he put it down. She could see the painted face in the frame. A young man, perhaps 20, with lighter hair than Gideon, and an expression of open, uncomplicated warmth. A brother's face. The floorboard shifted under her foot. He felt it. The change in him was immediate and total. The mask came back between 1 second and the next, smooth and complete, like a shutter closing. He set the portrait face down on the mantelpiece and picked up his chalkboard. "Forgive me. I thought I was alone." "I can leave," Leonora said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "Stay, there is correspondence that needs attention." She stayed. He handed her a sheaf of estate papers, tenant reports, a contested drainage easement, a letter from the county surveyor about the northern boundary. She read them aloud, her voice steady, because reading aloud for someone else was a thing she had done her whole life, and the habit was in her hands as much as her throat. When she reached the surveyor's letter, she stopped. "This measurement is wrong," she said. "The surveyor has the ridge line at 40 chains from the mill pond, but the original grant description puts it at 35. I have read enough property law to know the difference. My father is the county magistrate." Gideon had gone very still. "You have read land law. I have read everything my father kept. Case files, depositions, sealed reports, pharmaceutical texts, whatever was on the shelf." She paused. "I read the Castellan inheritance matter 3 years ago. The notation said per arrangement. I did not understand it then. The room was quiet." He wrote, "There is a second file in the 4th drawer. Will you read it as well?" She read that one, and the one after, and by the time the hall clock struck 10, she had corrected 2 figures, identified an error in a boundary deed, and noted an irregularity in a medication dispensing record from the Castellan household pharmacy that she could not yet explain. She was about to ask about it when Mr. Galt appeared at the library door. His face had the particular stillness of a man controlling a strong reaction. He carried a letter on a silver tray. He did not speak. He held the letter so Gideon could see the sender's name on the outside, Prentice Vane. Gideon's jaw tightened. He took the letter but did not open it. He held it the way you hold something you already know the contents of. "Read it." She read it. Prentice Vane, merchant, creditor, and apparently the holder of a prior contract signed between himself and the late Earl of Castellan, Gideon's father, claimed entitlement to a substantial portion of the Castellan estate. He was coming to press the matter in person. He was bringing his daughter. The silence in the library was complete. Gideon set the letter on the mantel beside the face-down portrait. He wrote one line, "Let him come." Mr. Galt withdrew. Gideon stood at the fire with his back to her for a long moment, and then, "The reading is done for tonight, my lady. Thank you." She excused herself and went upstairs. In her room, she sat at the writing desk and laid out what she knew in the only way that made sense to her, which was to write it in columns, like a pharmaceutical account, a young man's portrait held in the dark, a prior arrangement sealed by her father, a dispensing record with a missing entry, a deaf earl who navigated every room without a cane, without hesitation, who had oriented to a footfall in the library as precisely as a hunting dog orienting to wind, and Prentice Vane coming with a contract and a daughter, to claim what he said was his. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and let the shape of it settle. It was not what she had thought it was when she climbed into the carriage at Ashmore Grange. 15 minutes later, she heard Gideon's voice in the corridor, low, directed at Mr. Goult, with the particular quality of a man who could not hear himself speak, and had learned to calibrate his volume to other people's faces rather than his own ears. "Is the dispensary register from the last quarter still in the locked cabinet?" "Yes, my lord. Bring it to the study, and ask my wife to attend me." The fire in the study had burned low by the time she arrived. A second letter lay on the desk between them, this one sealed with the crest of the County Medical Board. The candle caught the wax. "Will you read this to me?" His voice was quieter than she had heard it, careful, in the way of someone who had spent years learning to manage the distance between themselves and sound. She broke the seal. The letter was a formal inquiry from the county medical examiner, addressed to the Earl of Castellan, marked private. It detailed the findings of a supplementary review into the death of Mr. Reuben Ashby, Gideon's younger brother, which had occurred 14 months ago, attributed at the time to sudden cardiac failure at the age of 24. The review had found anomalies. The symptom record in the days before Reuben's death, sourced from the Castellan household physician's notes, was inconsistent with idiopathic cardiac failure. The pattern was more consistent with a sustained accumulation of a compound in the digitalin family, which in sufficient concentrations caused precisely the symptoms Reuben had presented: irregular heart rhythm, visual disturbances, increasing fatigue, and then, on the last morning, collapse. The review noted that the dispensing register for the Castellan household pharmacy had a gap of 11 days in the relevant period. The review noted that Prentice Vane, whose daughter had been a frequent visitor to Castellan House in the months before Reuben's death, had assumed control of 3 of the Castellan commercial leaseholds within 6 weeks of the funeral, citing a contract signed by the late Earl. The review requested that the dispensing register be made available for examination. Leonora's hands were cold. Her voice did not waver. She read every word, every measured, careful, devastating word, and she did not soften a phrase, because the letter did not soften anything. When she finished, the room was very still. Gideon set down his pen. He looked at her, not the careful, managed gaze she had watched all evening, not the gaze of a man performing the ordinary work of moving through a world that did not accommodate him. His eyes found hers and held them with a precision that had nothing managed about it, direct and clear and fully present. "You can hear," Leonora said. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. "I hear everything," Gideon said. Leonora did not move. The room rearranged itself around her. Not violently, not the way a building collapses, but the way a room looks different when you turn the lamp up. Suddenly, you can see where the furniture actually is, and none of it is quite where you remembered it being in the dark. She thought of the wedding ceremony. His hand finding hers with that particular accuracy for the ring. She had noted it and then explained it away. She thought of the library, the shutter of his expression closing the moment the floorboard shifted. She had thought at the time that he had felt the vibration. She had been right about the mechanism and wrong about what it meant. She thought of dinner. His eyes on the footman, on the room, on her. She had believed she was watching a man reading his environment with compensating senses. She had been watching a man watch everything, and know that no one thought he was watching. She thought of the pharmacology text on her shelf. She set the letter on the desk. "How long?" she said. 14 months. Since your brother died. Since the night Reuben died, and Prentice Vane arrived at this house before the doctor had finished writing the death certificate. And I understood that the man who had been visiting for 3 months with his daughter, and his social warmth and his offers of commercial partnership, had known exactly what was going to happen. And that if I revealed what I suspected without proof, he would disappear before the law had anything to hold him with. Gideon's hands were on the desk, and they were not moving, but the stillness in them was the stillness of something held very tightly. He positioned his daughter as a prospective match for Reuben, he continued. While she visited, she had access to the household, the dispensary, the kitchen. Reuben trusted her. He told me once that she was the most attentive person he had ever known. He meant it as a compliment. Leonora thought of the dispensing register, the gap of 11 days. Digitalin accumulates, she said. It doesn't work quickly. Someone would need to administer it consistently, in small amounts over a period of weeks. Someone who had daily access and reason to be in the household, yes. And the dispensing register shows the gap. The gap is there because the entries were removed. Someone took 11 pages from the binding. I found the ragged edges 6 weeks after the funeral when I went looking, and the only person who had both the access and the knowledge to do it was Vane's daughter, who was training to be an apothecary before her father removed her from her apprenticeship to bring her here. Gideon looked at her directly. There is only one person in this county who can read a dispensing record the way a physician reads a chart, who has the pharmacological training to identify the symptom pattern and the legal knowledge to testify to the meaning of the gap in that register, who has a father in a position that Vane has spent 14 months purchasing the silence of. Leonora was very still. My father sealed a record. The notation reads Castellan, matter closed per arrangement. You told me yourself you had seen it. Your father received payment of his debts, £4,000, 6 weeks after Reuben's funeral. The payment came from a company registered to Prentice Vane, her father's ledger. The column of figures she had read upside down in his study the morning she left. You chose me, she said. I chose the only woman in England who had already seen the record, who understood the pharmacology, and who had enough reason of her own to want the truth of it told. You bought me to catch a poisoner. Gideon held her gaze without flinching. His voice was plain and level, stripped of the careful management she had watched all evening. I bought your knowledge. I would like to earn the rest. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. The fire settled in the grate. Outside the study windows, the Castellan grounds lay silent and dark and entirely still. Leonora stood on one side of the desk. Gideon sat on the other. Between them, the medical examiner's letter lay open, like a map of a country neither of them had wanted to travel to, and both of them now had no choice but to cross. Vane will come, Gideon said at last. He will arrive with his daughter and his forged contract and 14 months of careful positioning, and he will believe that I am deaf and that you are a magistrate's daughter sold cheaply to manage the household. We will let him believe both. He paused. And then we will be ready. Leonora did not sleep. She lay in the south rooms with the coverlet, pulled to her chin and went through it from the beginning methodically, the way she went through a medication account. Every detail she had noticed and set aside, every detail that now meant something different. The pharmacology text on her shelf. He had known what she read. The dispensing register in the locked cabinet. He had been keeping it. The 11 ragged pages. He had found them and told no one except the county medical examiner, and now her. In the north wing, Gideon Ashby was lying in his own bed with his eyes open, listening to a house that he could hear every sound of, and carrying the weight of 14 months alone. She understood the specific quality of that weight. She had been carrying her own version of it for years. In the morning, she came downstairs and found him at the breakfast table. His chalkboard was beside his plate. His eyes were directed at the window, not tracking, wide and unfocused. The performance back in place so seamlessly she would not have known it for a performance if she hadn't sat across from him the night before. She sat down and said nothing, and he said nothing, and between them the long table held all the ordinary furniture of a marriage that was not ordinary, and she buttered her toast and thought about 11 missing pages. The weeks that followed built something between them the way a bridge is built. One stone at a time, from both sides, working toward a middle that neither of them could see yet. During the day, the household moved to its rhythms. Gideon kept his habits, the chalkboard, the managed gaze, the particular stillness of a man performing not hearing while hearing everything. Leonora read correspondence to him each afternoon in the drawing room, her voice steady, her back to the window. Any servant listening at the door would have heard a wife reading letters to her husband who could not hear them himself. In the evenings, after the staff retired, the chalkboard went into the corner and stayed there. He moved through the drawing room without it, pouring his own wine, pulling files from the cabinet himself, carrying no part of the performance. He sat close enough at the desk that she could feel the warmth of his shoulder near hers, and he looked at the documents with her rather than past them. It was strange, those first evenings. She had grown accustomed to speaking to a man who appeared to hear nothing, and now she was speaking to a man who heard everything, including, she suspected, the small catch of breath she produced when his attention settled on her in a way that had nothing managed about it. She lost her place in the pharmaceutical record on the second evening, when he said her name without the chalkboard, said it the way you say something you have been turning over in your mind, not to get her attention, just to let it exist aloud. And she had to ask him to repeat his actual question, and he had almost smiled, which was the first time she had seen anything that might be one. On the fourth evening, he showed her the forged contract Vane had produced claiming entitlement to the Castellan leaseholds. She held it under the candlelight and read it twice, and then a third time. "This is not your father's hand," she said. "The formation of the capital letters is wrong. The way the C in Castellan closes, the arc is too tight. I have read enough legal documents to know the difference." She looked up. "And this annotation in the margin is in a pharmaceutical shorthand I recognize. It's the same shorthand used in the dispensing records from the household pharmacy." Gideon was very still, which means whoever forged this contract had access to both the household's pharmaceutical records and an example of your father's signature, she said. "That is not a combination a stranger could arrive at. That is someone who was inside this house for long enough to study both. Vane's daughter," he said. "Her name is Seraphine. She was here for 3 months. Seraphine Vane," Leonora said. "And she trained as an apothecary. She knows exactly what she gave Reuben. She knows it could not be detected without specific analysis. She knows the gap in the dispensing register could only be understood by someone who knew what to look for." He looked at Leonora across the desk. Until now. Lady Constance, who had said very little since the wedding, missed none of it. She occupied the east parlour most afternoons, working at an embroidery frame, with the concentration of someone who was not thinking about embroidery. She watched. The way Gideon's head turned the instant Leonora entered a room. The way he put the chalkboard down faster when she was there than when anyone else was. The way Leonora read the pharmaceutical records, not with the neutral voice of someone performing a service, but with the sharpening attention of someone solving a problem she had been working toward her whole life. One afternoon in the third week, Lady Constance stopped Leonora in the corridor outside the library. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect, my lady?" The old woman's eyes were precise and cool. "Clement Pryce's daughter. Sold to manage a deaf man's papers. I expected someone grateful and biddable and eventually broken by it." A pause. "Instead, I find a woman who corrects a boundary survey and reads a dispensing record with the eye of a physician." Lady Constance looked at her for a long moment. "3 nights ago I heard my nephew laugh. It came from the library. It has been 14 months since that sound was in this house." She turned and walked away. "Do not waste that, Miss Pryce." Leonora stood alone in the corridor for a moment, her hand at her sternum, and then went back to work. Prentice Vane arrived on a Wednesday in a hired coach with brass fittings and a driver who looked like he had been chosen for size. Vane himself was a compact, well-dressed man of about 50 with a red face and an expression of settled self-assurance, the expression of a man who had never once had to wonder whether a room was on his side. His daughter walked half a step behind him. Seraphine Vane was 21 and dark-haired, and had a quality of careful attention about her that Leonora recognized immediately because she had it herself. She catalogued everything she passed. Her eyes moved in the entrance hall the way Leonora's eyes moved in a dispensary, quick, professional, taking inventory. That evening, Gideon arranged a dinner. 8 of the county's notable families attended. Vane sat at Gideon's right hand. Seraphine sat 2 places from Leonora, close enough to watch. She moved Gideon's wine glass 3 inches to the right. He reached for it without hesitation. She waited to see if he reacted to a comment made quietly to her neighbour. He gave no sign of hearing. Then she turned to Leonora. "How remarkable," she said, her voice carrying easily down the table, "that his lordship found exactly what he needed in a magistrate's daughter." She smiled. Someone to manage the paperwork, someone from a family with debts enough to be grateful for any arrangement offered. She tilted her head. "I understand your father's accounts were rather badly disordered. Is it true he sold you, my lady, or is that an unkind exaggeration?" The table went quiet. Lady Ashworth set down her fork. The young physician from the valley fixed his eyes on the tablecloth. Leonora felt the words land. She felt the heat rise in her chest, specific and physical, and she held it there and let it be still, and let the silence exist for the full 3 seconds it needed. "I am the Countess of Castellan," she said. Her voice carried the length of the table without effort. "What I was before is what made me that. I would not change either part." The table exhaled. Someone near the end picked up a glass. Seraphine's smile did not waver, but something behind it recalibrated. Some private accounting that Leonora recognized as a revision of risk. That night, alone in her room with the door locked, Leonora sat down on the floor with her back against the bed and let the composure go. The shame came first, the particular shame of having your worst vulnerability named in public by someone who had done the research to find it. Clement Pryce's daughter, sold for a debt. She could hear the table's silence, the frozen forks, the careful way Colonel Ashworth had developed a sudden interest in the pattern of the tablecloth. The fury came after, slower and deeper. She had spent 14 years in her father's house, making herself useful in every way she could calculate, and the sum of that calculation had been £14,000 of unpaid debt and a marriage contract she had not seen before it was signed. And then, beneath both of those, the thing she could not breathe away, that Seraphine Vane had not been entirely wrong. The transaction had occurred. The papers existed. Whatever she built from here would be built on that foundation, and the foundation was exactly what Seraphine had named it. She sat on the floor for a long time. The knock, when it came, was soft and deliberate. 2 quiet taps. She knew before she stood. Gideon was in the corridor without his chalkboard. His face was the face she had seen in the library, the one beneath the one he wore for the household. He had heard the dinner. He had heard every word, and he was carrying the anger of it the way he seemed to carry everything. Very still, very controlled, and clearly at significant personal cost. "May I come in?" She let him in. He crossed to the window and stood there with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on the dark grounds below. For a long time neither spoke. "I am sorry," he said at last, "for what she said, for the fact that I sat there and could not answer it without destroying everything we have built." He paused. "She is testing me every day, the glass, the quiet comments. She needs to believe I hear nothing." "I know." He turned from the window. The candlelight was low, and his face in it was open in the way that cost him something. "I need to tell you about Reuben." He sat down in the chair by her desk, and he took a moment before he began. Reuben was 24 years old, and he had never in his life taken anything seriously except the people he loved, which he took more seriously than anything. He was unreliable about appointments and letters and the management of accounts, and entirely reliable about everything that mattered. He remembered the name of every tenant's eldest child. He wrote to our mother's old housekeeper every Christmas without fail. He had a gift for making people feel found. Gideon's voice was even, but his hands on his knees were not. He was the better part of this house. Every person in it knew it, including me. He looked at his hands. Vane arrived in August with letters of introduction and a proposal for a timber leasehold on the northern Castellan land. He was charming and businesslike, and Reuben liked him immediately, which I noted and did not think enough about. His daughter came with him. She was attentive and well-read, and she had trained in pharmacy, which gave her and Reuben a natural conversation. Reuben had always been interested in the natural sciences. She visited often. She brought him books. He stopped. She brought him something else. The fire in the grate shifted and settled. I did not know it was happening. The symptoms presented as fatigue first, then the visual disturbances, then the rhythm. By the time I recognized the pattern from the medical texts I had read after our mother's illness, it was October, and Reuben had 9 days left, and I did not know it. His voice did not break, but his jaw was working in the way of someone controlling something by increments. He died on a Monday morning. I was in the next room. I heard him fall. Gideon's hands were trembling, and he did not grip the fabric of his trousers to stop them. He let them shake. I carried him to the bed, and I held his hand, and I talked to him. I don't know what I said. I don't think it mattered what I said. And by the time the physician arrived, it had been 11 minutes, and it did not matter what the physician did either. The room was entirely still. He was 24 years old, Gideon said. He had not yet done half the things he intended to do. He had been planning to go to Edinburgh in the spring to study at the university. He had a particular interest in botanical medicine. A silence. She knew that. She used it. She gave him books and conversation and access to someone who seemed to share his interests. And then she gave him Digitalin in doses small enough to be invisible. And Reuben trusted her. And I was in the next room listening to him trust her. And I did not see it in time. He lifted his head. I have been pretending to be deaf for 14 months because the woman who poisoned my brother believes I cannot hear her testing me. And if she learns that I can, she will know that I heard every conversation she had in this house during those 3 months, including the one in the North Corridor on the 17th of September, when she told her father that it would be another 3 weeks. Leonora's breath stopped. You heard them plan it. I heard enough, not enough for a court, a single overheard comment with no corroboration and no witness, but enough to know, enough to spend 14 months building a case around it. He looked at her directly. I needed the dispensing record interpreted by someone who understood pharmaceutical accumulation. I needed the forged contract identified by someone who knew legal documents. I needed testimony from someone who had seen the sealed record in your father's office and could speak to its contents without needing the original produced. I needed a wife Seraphine could not position herself to replace, and I needed her quickly, before Vane moved to enforce the false contract. He paused. There is only one person in England who fits all of those requirements. My father sold me, Leonora said, and you bought me to finish what he buried. I bought your knowledge. He held her gaze. I intend to earn the rest. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his. After a moment, she took his hand and his fingers closed around hers. Not steady, not controlled, but the grip of a man who had been alone with something too large for one person for too long. She will not escape this, Leonora said. We will not let her. Gideon pressed his forehead against her hand and stayed there, breathing, and Leonora held on and did not move. They planned through what remained of the night. The county winter assembly at Grenville Hall was in 12 days. Every family of consequence would attend. Prentice Vane would attend. Seraphine Vane would attend, because the stage was exactly what she would not be able to resist. Leonora sat at her desk after Gideon left and wrote from memory in her own hand. The full pharmaceutical case which she carried in her head the way she carried everything. The symptom record, the accumulation timeline, the specific presentation of cardiac glycoside poisoning versus idiopathic failure, the 11-day gap in the dispensing register and what it indicated, the handwriting analysis of the forged contract and its link to the pharmaceutical shorthand. She wrote until the candle burned down and then lit another. She had never been able to write fast enough to keep up with what she remembered. Tonight she kept up. The Grenville Hall Winter Assembly fell on a Friday at the end of November. The great room was lit with 200 candles and smelled of pine boughs and mulled cider. 104 guests moved through it in the slow, purposeful circling of county society, which was to say, the circling of people who all knew each other's business and were engaged in the continuous collective project of deciding whose business mattered most tonight. Lady Constance was there in midnight blue, seated near the fire with a glass of sherry and a view of the entire room. Bridget had begged to come and stood near the cloakroom in her best dress, watching everyone. Gideon entered on Leonora's arm, his hand at her elbow, his eyes directed slightly past the room, in the careful way that had for 14 months made him invisible. Prentice Vane stood near the centre of the room, with a glass of brandy and the ease of a man who believed the evening was already settled in his favour. Seraphine was beside him in green silk, and she saw Gideon enter and smiled, the specific, satisfied smile of someone watching a mechanism work exactly as designed. She moved first. She crossed the room and stepped between Leonora and Gideon with the smooth efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the gesture, and she addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and her voice carried beautifully. "There is a matter I am obliged to raise, in the interest of this county's legal clarity." She produced a folded document from her evening bag and held it up for the Assembly's host, Lord Grenville, to see. A commercial and residential claim against the Castellan estate, signed by the late Earl, predating the current Lord Ashby's inheritance, witnessed and registered. She looked at Leonora with polite, specific regret. "I am sorry, my lady. prior claims must be honoured. I am sure you understand." Every face in the room turned to Leonora. Leonora stepped forward. Her hands were steady. Her voice was the voice she had used in her father's study for 8 years, and in Gideon's drawing room for 12 days, and it carried without effort. "That signature is forged." The murmurs stopped. "The capital letters in the late Earl's name are formed incorrectly. The T in the family name drops to the right. The late Earl's hand drops left consistently across 40 years of documented correspondence. I have read 7 years of Castellan estate records. I know this signature." She paused. "And the marginal notation on the second page is written in the pharmaceutical shorthand specific to the Castellan household dispensary, a shorthand that only one non-household person had access to for long enough to learn it." She turned to face Seraphine directly. Miss Vane trained as an apothecary for 2 years before her father removed her from her position. She was a resident guest at Castellan House for 3 months last year. She had access to the dispensary, the household correspondence, and the late Earl's documents. Seraphine's smile remained. "The Countess is understandably distressed. Reuben Ashby," Leonora said. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. 24 years old. Natural Sciences. Edinburgh in the spring. He died on a Monday morning in October 14 months ago, attributed to sudden cardiac failure. The county medical examiner's supplementary review found the symptom pattern inconsistent with idiopathic failure and consistent with sustained cardiac glycoside accumulation, consistent with repeated small-dose administration of a digitolin compound over 3 to 4 weeks. She did not look away from Seraphine. The dispensing register for the Castellan household pharmacy has 11 pages missing from the relevant period. 11 pages removed from the binding. The ragged edges are still present. She looked at the room. Miss Vane was present in this household for precisely those 3 weeks. She had access to the dispensary. She had a reason. The contract her father held, or believed he held, could not be enforced while Reuben lived, because Reuben had found the original signature was forged and intended to say so. The room was absolutely still. Seraphine took a step backward. Her hand found the edge of a table. A wineglass rocked, tipped, and shattered on the floor. The sound was enormous. Gideon set down his arm. He turned to Seraphine Vane and looked at her. Not the managed, unfocused gaze he had maintained for 14 months. Not the performance of a man who heard nothing and therefore threatened nothing. His eyes found hers with the directness of a man who had been listening to every sound she made for 14 months, who had heard her in the North Corridor on the 17th of September, who had held his brother's hand for 11 minutes on a Monday morning. "You gave him books," Gideon said. His voice was very quiet. It carried to every corner of the room. "He trusted you. He was 24 years old." Seraphine's face went the colour of the winter sky outside the windows. Leonora spoke the last line. "The county constable is in the vestibule, Miss Vane. He has been there since 9 o'clock." The room parted in silence. Mr. Aldridge entered from the vestibule with 2 county officers and the medical examiner. The silence held as they received the documents from Leonora's hands. The pharmaceutical case, the handwriting analysis, the medical examiner's letter, the forged contract. And as they approached Seraphine Vane, where she stood with her hand on the tilted table, surrounded by the broken glass of someone else's wine, Seraphine did not resist. She walked between the officers with her chin level and her face white and her hands very still, and the doors of Grenville Hall closed behind her. Prentice Vane, who had stood motionless throughout, turned and found Lord Grenville at his elbow and 2 additional officers at his back. The room held its breath for another 5 seconds. Then Colonel Ashworth, who had been staring at the tablecloth at Leonora's dinner 12 days ago, began to applaud. Slowly, deliberately, his big hands making a sound like a door opening. The sound moved through the room like warmth through cold stone, spreading from one person to the next, until it filled Grenville Hall from end to end. Lady Constance, seated near the fire with her sherry, lifted her glass in Leonora's direction. Bridget at the cloakroom door was crying with her fist pressed to her mouth. Leonora stood in the middle of the noise and let it wash over her. She did not raise her arms. She did not address the room. She turned and found Gideon's hand, and he took it. And for the first time since she had climbed into the carriage at Ashmore Grange, She felt the floor hold steady under her. The carriage ride back to Castellan House was dark and quiet. They sat across from each other, the lantern swaying on its hook. Gideon had not picked up his chalkboard since the assembly. He did not need it. He looked at her directly, the way she now understood he had always been capable of, and for a long time neither of them spoke because the silence was not empty. Then he leaned forward. "I chose you because I needed you," he said. "I am asking because I want you. Not for the case, not for the evidence or the testimony or the contract. For me, for whatever comes next, which will be quieter than this, and which I would like very much not to face alone." His voice was rough and careful, stripped of every register except the one underneath. "Will you stay? Not as my wife for the law, as my wife because you choose to." Leonora looked at him across the lantern's light. She thought of the pharmacology texts on her shelf, placed there before he had met her, by a man who had done the research. She thought of the drawing room in the evenings, his shoulder near hers over the ledger, the almost smile. She thought of his hands, shaking in her room, not hidden, not controlled, the hands of someone who had decided she was worth the cost of being seen. She reached across and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned into it the way something turns toward warmth, his eyes closing, and she felt the tension he had been carrying for 14 months settle slightly in his face. "I have been staying since the library," she said, "when you set the portrait down and asked me to stay and read." He pressed his forehead to her hand. The carriage carried them home. 18 months later, Castellan House was different in the way that houses become different when the people in them stop performing for each other. The North Wing and the South Wing were no longer separate territories. Doors stood open that had been closed since October 2 years ago. Light moved through the house differently, or perhaps it was the same light, and the rooms had simply been rearranged to let it in. Leonora's writing desk sat in the library beside Gideon's. Their papers mingled on the surface in the productive disorder of two people, working on different parts of the same problem. Mr. Fitch, the apothecary, had become a regular correspondent. She was writing a monograph on pharmaceutical symptom patterning and its application to estate health records, and Gideon had read every draft and corrected her Latin and argued with her methodology in the margins, in a handwriting she now knew as well as her own. The staff had stopped the particular careful quietness that had defined the household for 14 months. Bridget hummed. Mr. Galt had been observed on 3 separate occasions to smile. In the garden, Gideon sat on the stone bench with a child in his arms, 8 months old, fair-haired, with his father's steady grey eyes and her mother's habit of examining everything she was shown with the focused intensity of someone taking notes. Gideon was telling her the names of the birds in the bare-branched ash tree above them, with the specific seriousness of a man who believed she could understand him, which she probably could not yet, but which Leonora thought would be true sooner than anyone expected. Lady Constance arrived on Thursdays with shortbread and opinions, and today she sat beside Gideon on the bench, with her hand on the child's head, and said, without looking up, "She has Reuben's chin." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, "She does." It was the first time Leonora had heard him speak Reuben's name without the word costing him. The wound was there. It would always be there. But it had become something he could carry without bracing for it, and the child in his arms was part of that, and so she knew, was she? That afternoon a letter arrived from the county court. Leonora opened it at her desk. The trial date for Seraphine Vane and Prentice Vane had been set for the Hillary term. The court required the Countess of Castellan to provide written testimony. The court also required the testimony of the county medical examiner regarding the pharmaceutical findings. Mr. Aldridge had enclosed a secondary note, marked for the Countess's attention alone. She read it twice. During the preparation of trial documents, the court's investigator had identified a third set of records, a correspondence held by a solicitor in Edinburgh, letters between Prentice Vane and a party whose identity had not yet been confirmed, which suggested that Vane's scheme at Castellan had not been his first, that a previous household in the northern county had lost a young heir to similar circumstances 3 years earlier, that the matter had been ruled natural causes and sealed, that the sealing had not been without assistance. The letter did not name the party. Leonora set it down and looked through the library window at her husband in the garden, holding their daughter, watching the birds. He looked up, as he always did, and found her through the glass. She picked up her pen. There was more to do.